Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. Let's talk about Tier 0 and what it actually means, or more specifically, what I believe Tier 0 means in Yu-Gi-Oh! Or just in anything in general. So what Tier 0 collectively means for the community is basically a deck that is so dominant that it takes up generally a large percentage of the metagame. We're currently on Road of the King to kind of look at the metagame currently in the OCG, where we can see Fire King and Voiceless Voice are pretty standout decks, while quite a few other decks are still floating around and seeing quite a few tops and plays. So obviously, not a Tier 0 deck. Or more specifically, not a Tier 0 meta. But I want to offer, or basically toss my hat into the ring, and basically say, I think that there is a better way of describing Tier 0 than just a mathematical percentage of top cuts. And the reason I say this is because I don't really think that there is a great way of saying, hey, it's just however many top. Because there are times where that number just isn't there, where it's not actually just X amount, and is instead just based on feeling, right? Where something can genuinely be the best deck in the room by far, and yet isn't technically putting up the results necessary to call it a Tier 0. So, basically what I want to say is, Tier 0 is subjective. But I do want to talk about it in general. Starting off with classic examples of Tier 0 decks that technically didn't ever actually get to Tier 0. Tearlament post, kind of like the first hits, post Sprite falling out of the metagame, and most notably with the Ishizus, but post their first limitations, with all of the limitations to the Ishizus and all of that stuff, still were Tier 0. But it never had the results. While it does say here, like, oh, look, 79 Tearlament to the next best deck of 10 in Runic, right? And this is across many different tournaments, so sure, in individual tournaments, Tearlament may have popped up more and more and may have been better, but there were still a myriad of decks that were competing, but none of them were nearly as competitive as Tearlament, right? And this is what I'm actually talking about. A deck like this very clearly is Tier 0, but doesn't quite have that illustrious number of 50 or 60% top cut conversion rates, especially when you're comparing it to, especially when you're comparing it to things like Zodiac or Spiral, which very clearly were Tier 0. I mean, I remember seeing Spiral lists where basically it was one deck that was not Spiral in a top cut. And that was pretty standard for Spiral. That was pretty standard for Zodiac. You basically got to see the entirety of the card that showed up, right? But obviously with Tearlament, and even with Sprite, it didn't quite do that same thing. Now, obviously, you had Sprite Evil Twin, which technically in this example could have pushed it over the edge, depending on your definition, right? Is it 50%? Is it 55%? Is it 60%? But very clearly, this is the best deck in the room, and it's not really close. The other decks, sure, maybe could compete. You know, you have some Branded, you have some Therion. Therion's got, man, the OCG loves Sky Striker, sorry. There's some Tri-Brigade stuff. There's Branded Tearlaments before the Ishizu stuff. And I think before, like, almost everything. I think it was just, like, the first wave of support, which is kind of funny. But you can very clearly see that while these technically are Tier 0 in our mind, they didn't really hit that note, right? And this is kind of where I want to kind of dispel that discussion of being like, it has to hit this specific percentage. It's got to be this specific thing. Because to me, it's always been about, is it the best deck in the room? That's not true. It's not always been about that for me. But more recently, I've started to think about it as, is it the best deck in the room? Is it by far the best thing you should be playing? And are you only going to be playing that or a counter to that? And if that is the case, yeah, it's very clearly a Tier 0 meta. While it may not have the results or the tops, you are going to be mindfully preparing for that deck and for its counters in your play and in your deck building. and most notably in your deck building, right? As we can see here, Tearlament, Runic was the next best deck. Why do you think? Because Runic can play a bunch of floodgates that stop Tearlament. Things like Dimensional Fissure, things like There Can Be Only One, or Rivalry, or Gozen, or all of these other floodgates that can really slow the opponent down and basically prevent them from playing the game. And also, Exo-Sister hadn't really been explored. Is Shizu Exo-Sister? That's wild. That's very, very funny. So, yeah. Obviously, the decks that are going to be able to counter it are going to be the decks that you are most likely going to be playing against, right? Even the Sword Soul variant was playing a whole bunch of Bystials in its deck lists, right? To allow it to also be able to beat Tearlament. So again, very clearly, Tier 0 didn't quite have those results. And we can even look at this if we go into Master Duel. Now, notably, Master Duel has a tier list function for tournament decks, but as you can see, there's not really any tier 1, Soul Tier 1, Tier 0, or anything like that. It's a pretty balanced meta, as we can see here. But the main reason I wanted to bring this up is actually the way that specifically the Duel Links meta tier list works, or specifically what they call it, because I do like these. Tier 1 is expected to be a large percentage of top cut in competitive tournaments. We have Tier 2, which is expected to be in the top cut of competitive tournaments, but not a large percentage. And then Tier 3 is expected to be played in competitive tournaments with possibility of being in the top cut, which I think is a brilliant way of putting all three tiers. Now, I would just say Tier 3 is basically Rogue in my mind, but that is more or less what these three tiers are. And that's why I have started doing tier lists in a similar fashion. Tier 1, expected to be large percentage. Tier 2 is expected to be there, but maybe not as a large percentage. And then Tier 3 is probably going to top, maybe not. Who knows, right? It's right there in that middle. And then, obviously, high potential, or what most people would consider Rogue, is there. And I would just put that as everything else, because, honestly, yeah, it could top. It's probably not going to, but it could. Anyway, this basically means that when it comes to Tier 0, nothing should be Tier 1. Maybe you have something that's Tier 2, like, again, for example, here with True Draco. That is a pretty large percentage outside of Zodiac that is True Draco. Though, to be fair, it's very funny in this list. It's actually just all Zodiac. It was a lie. You've been tricked. It's all Zodiac. There's actually only 2 True Draco decks. The rest were either Zodiac or Zodiac. Or Zodiac. Zodiac was very good, by the way. But, with Spiral, we can look at Zephyra, we can look at Infernoid as other options as well, and they are also expected to be a fairly large percentage of that top cut. Right? And so because of that, they're not really ever going to break that Tier 1, or into that Tier 1 status, right? Which is pretty self-explanatory. Now, another reason I wanted to bring this up is because of Onomats in Duel Links. If you didn't play Duel Links, that's totally fine. Just stay with me. So here in the history section, we can see that the Onomats have this large stint where they are all Tier 1. They're not quite Tier 0. But let's be honest, I played during that time, and they were by far and away the best thing you should be playing, especially in tournaments. If you weren't playing Onomats, you were actively making a mistake already, immediately in deck choice. But yet it was almost never Tier 0. It was Tier 0 for an instant, but it never really was technically Tier 0. Even though there were many results that had 50%, even 60% top cut being Onomat. But it never quite got there. It kind of did, but it didn't stay there. And this is where I think Tier 0 having a specific hard line that you have to meet to be Tier 0 really does hinder an understanding of what a Tier 0 meta is. And the last point that I want to bring out is I really don't think there's likely to be another Tier 0 meta in most games for a while. And the reason I bring this out, or I should say, in the same fashion as something like Zodiac or Spiral, where it is absolutely dominant and has almost a 90 or a 60% conversion rate in top cut, or more specifically, over that 60% threshold. And the main reason I bring this up is because, again, looking at things like Sprite, looking at things like Tearlament, these are some of the most pushed, absolutely insane decks of all time, and they didn't have that number. Why is that? Well, simply put, they weren't actually able to fully hard win games due to the insane amount of comeback options, hard counters, etc. that just allowed other decks to have blowout options. Sure, Tearlament could make this incredible end board if they so chose, or could play on your turn, whether going first or going second or going fifth or whatever. Tearlament could basically always have an option. They also could just lose to Shifter. That was entirely an option and a thing that could happen. And on top of that, with how consistent decks have become, you could just tech in random cards. Like in Sprite, you could tech in Curse of Anubis. I think that's what it's called. Or Hand of Anubis or something like that. And then just make Mannequin Cat. And then as soon as it summoned a Dark Monster, you would just summon the Anubis and entirely turn off the graveyard. And you could just do that because you were expecting to play against this deck. And I think every deck going forward is going to have some sort of silver bullet. Hell, even right now in the OCG, Fire King is by far the best deck, but there is a hard counter to it. It's called Soul Release. Yeah, that card. You know? This very old... Oh, are they not playing it? That's very funny. Very old card. Let's see if anyone's playing it here. Funnily enough, no. Instead, they're playing the Dependable Die, something like that. The Banish effect from the trap card. But yeah, anything that banishes. Wow, crazy. They're basically going to do the same thing to this to this deck. So it's more so now. Is there ever realistically going to be that 70% conversion rate, that 60% conversion rate that we need to necessarily call something Tier 0? Probably not, right? But this could also have been a Tier 0 metagame. You are very clearly planning to play and planning to beat Fire King, and a lot of decks that are specifically designed to beat them, like Flunder, are going to be around and specifically played so that they can beat them. Could this be considered Tier 0? Obviously, I wouldn't say that this is, but it's something to keep in mind. Yes, maybe it's not by far the best deck in the room, but maybe it is. And that's what I ultimately wanted to talk about. Just Tier 0 in general, and more specifically, the fact that a lot of these decks nowadays just aren't really going to have that conversion rate that we think of, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be not Tier 0. So, that's going to be it for this episode. If you guys have something else that you think would classify as Tier 0, let me know down below in the comments. If you would disagree with me, let me know. But thank you guys so much for watching. If you did indeed enjoy it, like it very much, so appreciate it. And remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Shout out to the Frost Guard, my members. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy the content.